Welcome back. I'm really glad you're here. This is our last episode talking about summer camp for this year. So, this episode covers the last 2 days of week 5 of our summer camp. On Wednesday, one of the things that I had noticed, one of the kids who was new on week 5 had a certain interest. Sometimes we call it a special interest. And here's the thing with special interests. We all have them. We just have them to varying degrees. And it's actually kind of a hallmark of autism and ADHD that people go really deep into their special interests. So where neurotypical people may have certain things that they really enjoy, they really like to talk about, for those of us who are neurodivergent, not only do we enjoy them and like to talk about them, but we know way more about them than the average person. So even if I have the same special interest as a neurotypical person, I most likely will know way more about it than this other person does. It also sometimes with our brain wiring can cross the line into being a bit of an obsession or a compulsion. And so I don't ever want to minimize the things that my students are interested in. I do want to redirect them towards people who are also interested in that thing. And I've talked about that several times during camp, but I don't ever want to steer them away from the things that they're interested in. I think anything anybody's interested in, there's a community for it, especially with the internet. Anything anybody's interested in, you can find a community of other people who are also interested in that thing. What I try to be aware of is when an interest in something interferes with our daily functioning. So it's kind of like if you think about a compulsion, right? That's what a compulsion is it's interfering with your daily functioning. I had noticed the place where we were for summer camp was very close to the airport. And so I had noticed that one kiddo on week 5, anytime he could hear an aircraft going over, which is all the time, he would stop. And if we were inside, he would run to a window. If we were outside, he would run to where he had a clear view of it. And when I first noticed it, my immediate thought was, there's going to be a time where this becomes a problem. But right now it's not. Right now it's not interfering with anything they were doing. But I had that thought, there's going to be a time where his reaction, his kind of compulsion to go see this craft is going to become a problem. That time came on Wednesday. When we walk to the park, part of the path that we take is like a trail that's been tread on the ground. And part of it is the paved trail that everybody else is taking. So for as long as we've been on this path, which is since 2021, my rule is always that we walk on the right side of the path. And I say that multiple times every day that we're on the path, we walk on the right side of the path. And I always reinforce that it's so that we're not in anybody's way. Because we go at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, there's not as many people out as there would be in the morning or in the evening, but there are still people out. There are people riding their bikes. There are people walking their dogs. There are people running. And so it's important to me that the kids learn how to be good trail stewards and be respectful on the trail. So we always talk about walking on the right side. But I do know that to the kids who have never had an encounter on the trail, it's a very abstract concept to them, right? Like if they've never seen or been in a position where other people are trying to pass them, I can say that all I want, but it's pretty abstract. On Wednesday, we got to the place where the dirt trail meets the paved trail. And so we take a right turn to get on the paved trail. And shortly after we take a left turn, And so one of the kids, when we got onto the paved trail, went all the way across the trail right into oncoming cyclists. They almost ran over him. And so apologized to them and stopped the group and was pointing out how this is why I make a big deal about us staying on the right side of the trail. This is exactly why, because that almost was an accident. And we would have been the ones to get hurt because they have a bike, right? We would have been the ones to get hurt. So we're having this conversation and an airplane goes by. And it was the kiddo who was in the middle of the trail that is the one who has a fascination for airplanes. So as we're having this conversation, he runs back into the middle of the trail to try to see the airplane. So I was very firm with him at that point, because number one, I was talking to the group, which it's not that often that I command everybody's attention to have a discussion with them about something. It's not that often that happens. So number one, we were having a discussion. And number two, it was actually about him, because he's the one who almost got run over by the bicycles. So I was very firm with him at that point that we're not running across the trail to look at airplanes. We're having a conversation right now. And then we went on. And at the playground, we can always see lots of airplanes at the playground. When we were back later that afternoon, there are two main rooms that we use in our facility, and one of them is all windows and one of them has no windows. So it's like you walk into the waiting room and then you walk into the middle room, which doesn't have windows, and then you walk into the back room, which is all windows. And there are windows, internal windows, between the middle room and the back room. So the full thing is lighted, but you can't see outside from the middle room. You have to get up and go into the back room. So this kiddo who was really interested in airplanes was playing a game with his partner on the floor in the middle room. And every time he would hear an airplane, he would get up and run into the back room to watch it out the window. And his partner didn't really understand what was happening. And so he was just getting a little bit frustrated about it. And so I finally just said to the kiddo, I said, I wonder what your partner thinks every time you get up to run to the other room to look out the window. I wonder how he feels about that. And that's it. That's all I said, because I just want to plant that seed. If his partner wants to say something about it, he can. But my goal is just to plant that seed so that he can see things from his partner's perspective. That every time he hears an airplane, he's getting up and he's leaving the game and going into another room. And his partner, I don't know that he knew what was happening or not. But even if he did, I don't know that he would be quite as accepting of it. So just planting that seed for him to help him be more aware. Even as adults, this is something that we all have to figure out. We all have to find the balance between giving our attention to the things that we're really interested in and giving our attention to the things that are a priority at that time. The first thing that comes to my mind is like our phones, being on social media, replying to emails. There are just times where you have to give your attention to the things that are important and that are a priority. Somebody having a conversation with you should be more important than answering a message on your phone, for example. Having dinner with your family should be a priority over scrolling Facebook, for example. So there's just times where we all have to make that choice to give our attention to the things that should be a priority versus the things that we would really like to spend all day, every day, giving our attention to. The walk to the park and back, it's about half a mile each way. And so as camp goes on, less and less kids complain about it. We just get used to it. It just is what it is. And it's an enjoyable walk. Every time kids are new, there's always somebody that complains about it. But one of the things I really, really love, one of my favorite moments with kids is when I can joke with them. especially kids who haven't really been jokey before. The first time that we can joke together, oh, I love that so much. It's one of my favorite moments. And especially kids who maybe previously weren't really jokey, but then they develop a more funny personality. I just love that so much. Being able to understand humor is such a valuable social skill. Just being able to understand when people are just being playful and being silly. We call it friendly teasing. We have a whole lesson on that too. So one of the kids was just kind of, complaining about having to walk to the park. And he said, I said, "Oh, you have a car? You have a driver's license? You haven't told me this?" He's like 10, and he's like, "No, but you do." And I said, "Yeah, I do." And I said, "You know what? If I decided to drive to the park, you know who I would take with me? I would take all the kids who aren't complaining." And then I always smile really big when I'm joking to make it obvious that I'm joking. And he started smiling too. And so I just love that like he could tell I was playing, and then he was, we were able to like banter and be silly a little bit. I just love that so much. Um, for our activity for Wednesday, I started it. I knew that the way I started it, they were going to think we were doing one thing, and then I totally changed it up. So what I did is I had everybody tell me the first sentence to a story, and I wrote everybody's on a different piece of paper. So student 1, student 2, student 3, student 4, they all had a different piece of paper with the first sentence that they came up with. And then I gave their paper to somebody else, and the other person got to draw their interpretation of what this story was going to be. One of the kids, his first sentence was about a character, a fictional character that he's really into. Well, his story got given to someone else, and they were sitting next to each other. And he said, "Can I show you what this character looks like?" And the student who now had that sentence immediately said, "No, because it's my drawing. I get to draw it how I want to." And I thought that was such a great response. Neither one of them were rude or disrespectful about it, but it was such a great response on his part, like a self-confident response. And it was a really appropriate response also. So the other kiddo wasn't really happy with that answer, but there's not really much you can argue with that answer. And so they both moved on. And then after we finished the activity, then the kid asked again if he could show him what the character looks like. And then they compared drawings of what they had made. But I just thought that was it was just a really great response. Like, no, because this is my drawing, right? It just showed a lot of, I can't think of the term I'm trying to think of, but like self-respect almost, to just be able to stand up for yourself in a non-aggressive way. So I thought that was a really cool interaction. For game time, what I had the kids do is everybody got to pick a game, and then I had them pick a partner and figure out how to play their two games together. They could either play them one at a time, or they could actually combine them and try to like make up a new game. There were two kids where one of them just kind of got really stuck on wanting to play the game that he had chosen. They had a conversation between the two of them about how his game took a long time to play. And so if they did that, they wouldn't be able to play the other kid's game, which was very true. And he just got really stuck on only wanting to play his game. So I intervened and I just said, the other kiddo finally agreed to just play his game. And I said, since he agreed to play your game, I'm going to say that he gets to choose his color and he gets to go first, because he was really flexible by agreeing to do something that wasn't even what he chose. So I think it's fair that he gets to pick his color and he gets to go first. And the other kiddo was very fine with that. But I just felt like I don't want kids to be the pushover. I want them to feel comfortable standing up for themselves. I want them to feel comfortable saying no. I want them to know that their opinion matters and their preference matters. And I don't want anybody to be that kid that everybody can just kind of walk on and know that if you're his partner, then he'll play whatever you want to play. And so I just wanted to step in on his behalf and give him a little bit more power in that situation, because I feel like it wasn't that he didn't want to play the game he chose. He just didn't really want to deal with the conflict. And so I wanted to give him like some extra power in that situation. One of the interesting things that had come up, it might have started the week before, is this phrase, "I'm not talking to you." I think it was the week before. One of the kids was saying something to another kid, and a third kid responded. And so the first kid said, "I'm not talking to you." The interesting thing about that phrase, I don't know that I've ever really thought about this before, but I think it happened 3 times in the last 2 weeks of camp, is that when one of the kids would say it, they weren't saying it to be rude. They were saying it as a statement of fact. But that phrase is a hard phrase to say without it sounding rude. And so that's what happened every time, is the kiddo who was, it was different kids too, it wasn't even the same, but the kiddo who was saying it would be saying it as a matter of fact, but it would get interpreted as being rude. And I really had to think about that, because usually what I'll say if something comes across as rude is I'll say something like, "How else can you say that?" But with that phrase, I don't know that there is a different way to say that. And so when it happened on Wednesday of week 5, after it had already happened on week 4, it was the kiddo who said it in week 4 that got his feelings hurt when someone said it to him in week 5. And so we just talked about recognizing that that kiddo wasn't talking to you. And so he's not trying to be rude by saying that. He's just being honest that he was talking to someone else. But it was just interesting for me because I never did think of another way that you could make that point without being rude. And I think in the real world, what we typically do as adults is if something like that happens, we might just ignore the third person and go back to talking to the person we were talking to. And that's actually one of our lessons in the 3rd module, January through March. We talk about joining a conversation and how sometimes when we try to join a conversation, we're not accepted. And that's what that is. That's what that is playing out. It's just that there's a disconnect between the intentions of the person who's saying it and the perception of the person who's receiving it. But I think typically people don't say, "I'm not talking to you." I think they just ignore the third person who's trying to join the conversation, because that's what was happening, is it was somebody just trying to join the conversation that they heard, which is something I teach the kids to do. It's a really great social skill. I think it's that our kiddos were being more blunt about it than you would typically encounter in a social situation. And so that was just a really interesting dynamic, because it happened, like I said, I think it happened 3 times. And each time I'm thinking, gosh, he's not saying it to be rude. And it's different kids, he's not saying it to be rude, but it's being interpreted as rude. And I can't even think of another way to really say that. And so again, I think that's where a lot of people would just not respond, instead of saying like, "I wasn't talking to you," or, this, as we use, "This is an A-B conversation, see your way out," I think a lot of people would just choose to not acknowledge that third person. Okay, that brings us to our last day of summer camp. On our last day, it stormed. So we only had, I think this was only our 2nd day that we missed the playground during the summer camp, but it was a rough day to miss the playground because it was our last day. And even after it stopped storming, it meant everything's muddy. And we've been there before. So we just stayed at Starfish on this day. What I did was I set a timer every 30 minutes and I gave them really a choice of what they wanted to do. But every 30 minutes when the timer went off, they had to move to a different activity. So that way they weren't just doing the same thing all afternoon. So they could play games. I even brought out the Legos. I brought out the drawing stuff. But every 30 minutes, they had to change and go do something different. They could come back the next time the timer went off, but when the timer went off, they needed to move on and do something different. So that worked pretty well. We did talk about Legos, that when the timer goes off and it's time for you to move on, if you're not able to put them down and move on, I'm going to put them away. And I actually did end up having to do that. Two of the kids weren't able to put them down and move on. And so about halfway through the afternoon, I ended up putting the Legos away. The older kids, there were 4 of them in a group on Thursday. They just played games the entire time together. And they played the same game for, I think, an hour and a half. And finally, I was like, hey, guys, why don't we pick a new game? But they're just chill. They've all been at Starfish for several years. They know each other. They get along really well. They're just chill. And so I told them they didn't have to change every 30 minutes because I knew that they would be able to handle if they got bored, if they want to do something different. Usually the younger kids that we just don't always have the skill set to handle being bored or needing a change. So they just play games together the entire afternoon. And sometimes the younger kids would go join them. So sometimes the younger kids would kind of filter in and out of their game. There were 2 kids that get along really well, and they had chosen, one of the kids wanted to play a specific game and the other kid didn't want to play that game. And so they agreed on a second game. And then after about 5 minutes, the second kid changed his mind and wanted to play the game the other kid initially wanted to play. So they put that game away and went to play the first game. And then the kid said, he asked the first kiddo if he was upset with him for changing his mind. And I thought that was just a really cool self-awareness moment, that is like he recognized, first he had told the kid no, and then the other kid agreed to play what he wanted to play, and then he changed his mind. So I just thought that was really great self-awareness for him to think, oh, maybe that other kid's kind of bothered by that. That was like me changing my mind a lot. So that was a really cool self-awareness thing. One of the things that happens quite a lot, actually, specifically around Uno, I definitely noticed this around the game of Uno, is Uno has developed its own, well, Uno has, people have developed all kinds of rules for Uno that are not the actual rules of Uno. And the challenge with that is that our kids don't understand that. So they know how to play Uno the way they've learned how to play Uno, which is usually based on whoever they typically play it with, whether it's family, whether it's friends. But very rarely do 2 people have the same Uno rules. So, for example, the biggest one I see, the biggest conflict is that per Uno rules, if you don't have a card to play, you draw 1 card, and if you can't play it, you lose your turn. But a lot of people play where you draw until you get a card that you can play. So that's the number 1 conflict I see, is people trying to do that each way and then getting upset with each other, when really it's just 2 people with a different understanding of how to play. Other things that I see are stacking. So stacking is where if somebody plays a draw 2, instead of drawing 2, you play a draw 2, and now the next person has to draw 4. But if they have a draw 2, they play a draw 2, and now the next person has to draw 6. Okay, so that's stacking, which is not an actual Uno rule. And so Uno can just get really complicated because different people have different ideas of how to play without recognizing that the way they're playing is not the actual Uno rules. So this came up on Thursday. I actually can't believe it took until the last day of summer camp to come up this year. But we just had a conversation about it, and I explained to the kids what was happening, that, you guys are just used to playing a different way. And I explained to them how the actual rules of Uno work. Sometimes it happens with Sorry also. Sorry can sometimes get some secret rules, but for Uno, it's very common that different people play it differently. And so once I explain that, everybody's fine. And then they just have to agree on what rules they're going to play by. But again, it just all comes back to helping kids understand that we all process and think about things differently. And we only know based on our experience. So if you have someone else who's got a different experience, that's what they know. It's the same, when I have kids who one of them's trying to play by the rules and one of them's trying to play pretend. It's hard for them to recognize that they're just playing from two different perspectives. But once I explain that to them, it's like, oh, okay, well, how do you want to play? And then they can figure it out. It's just helping them understand where the disconnect is. And I think this is the core of like all miscommunication amongst humans is two people or more just not understanding the other person's perspective, not understanding the way the other person is viewing the situation, and not recognizing that we all view everything just a little bit differently. And so it's not that someone views something the same way you do and they just want to disagree with you. It's that they're viewing it a different way. And so I think this is the basis for all miscommunications and misunderstandings. And it's when I see it with the kids, it's such an easy solution for me to just explain how each one of them is perceiving the situation. And I can even do this with kids and parents. Oh, well, kiddos thinking this and parents thinking this. And then they're both like, oh, okay. The same, I think I kind of straddle the neurotypical world and the neurodivergent world. And so I find that I can do that really well also. Explain how someone who is autistic is thinking and how their boss or parent or friend who's not autistic is thinking, just so they understand the way the other person is thinking. So I just think that's the base of so many of our conflicts and misunderstandings is we don't have the ability to understand how another person thinks unless we have some insight into it, or unless they tell us. And we all just assume that people think the way that we do. And nobody ever thinks the way that we do. Even if somebody agrees with you about something, they probably agree with you for a different reason than why you agree on that thing. You guys probably come to the same outcome, but by following different paths to get there. Okay. Let me see. I think the only other thing on Thursday, one of the kids I could tell was just kind of off on Thursday. He was pretty upset that it was our last day. He kept talking about it. One of the other kids made a comment about, when am I going to see you guys again? So Thursday was just a little bit of a weird day because we weren't able to go to the park. Some of the kids were just kind of off with it being our last day. And I think for some of them, it was just like kind of sad for them that it was our last day. So it was just a bit of a different day. But we had an amazing 5 weeks of summer camp. I'm really grateful for being able to see all the students that I hadn't seen since the previous summer, all the new kids that we had this year. I think I mentioned I stopped allowing new kids to register for camp a few years ago because it's hard. It's hard to have that many new kids at one time. So this is the first summer that I've allowed new kids to register for camp. And I'm really glad that I did. I think it just added a great dynamic to the mix, and it was a really fun summer. I really am glad for all the kiddos and all the parents and just the great 5 weeks that we had. So that is our wrap up of summer camp. We are going back to Zoom for the school year. And so that's what's happening next. I'm not sure when this one will publish, probably around the time we're registering for August. So starfishsocialclub.org is where you can learn all about it. If you go to the Join the Club tab, that's where you can learn about the year-round program. That's what's coming up next. It runs August through May, 4 different modules. Each module is 8 weeks long. And you register by joining the waiting list. Our current families have priority registration. And so once they register, I see how many spots we have left, and then I go to the waiting list to enroll people off of our waiting list. The groups meet on Zoom in the evenings during the school year, 2 hours a week, which can either be back to back or it can be on 2 separate days. And 1 hour is lesson based and 1 hour is game based. And so that's how our evening groups work during the school year. You can learn all about it. Starfishsocialclub.org, go to the Join the Club tab. You'll be able to see what we talk about each week, what each module is about, and then the button is there where you can join the waiting list. So thank you for joining all our activities and adventures vicariously this summer. I hope that you've had an amazing time just like I have. I will see you again next time.